But
Yeah,
yeah,
for
today
sure.
we're happy to have, I think we're going to be talking about Twitter scrapping and all the cool things Ronen has been up to. So really
Yeah,
excited about that.
looks like most people are here, so we can probably kick that off if you're ready, Ronan.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't sure like who would show up and like what the background would be, so I'll try to adapt on the fly. I feel like most of you have heard about this. I don't want to repeat myself too much, but maybe there's some newcomers, so maybe I'll kind of go over the background um, just briefly. So I can share my screen, or do you prefer that I do the Figma, that we all go into Figma and then you follow the cursor there? What
Oh
is,
yeah,
Up to you.
drop the Figma link.
yeah. So we can go here. Oh, maybe sorry, I dumped this in the notes. Ellie, maybe you want me to put it
Yeah,
somewhere else?
I'll drop that in here. Oop.
Cool.
And then I think if you double click
Okay.
yourself, you can spotlight yourself and everyone can follow you.
Okay, great. So
Yeah, perfect.
cool. Yeah, okay, great. So yeah, so I'll set just a little bit of context for people who haven't heard about the project. And the context for this is actually right now I'm starting a program called the Astera and Entrepreneurship in Residence, which you may have heard of. It's a kind of adjacent research institute looking at meta science questions. And one of the sort of things they're trying to promote in the coming years is rethinking science publishing and review practices, infrastructure for communication. And this project is kind of one of the projects, the initial projects as part of this program. So it's kind of an entrepreneurial residency where I'm going to try to build the things I'm talking about during that year, and working, of course, with the DeSci lab folks and kind of being part of this ecosystem. So I'll tell you a little bit about the project. The project is basically combining DeSci and social media for new kinds of experiences in exchanging scientific information and publishing. And I like to think of it as sort of this intersection of three interrelated problems in publishing. So you can see this kind of a diagram where one sort of challenge is adjusting science from the sort of old school paper publishing to the new trend of publishing much more diverse range of scholarly outputs, like research outputs. So a great example of this is nano publications. For those of you who haven't heard of this project, it's a way to sort of publish atomic units of knowledge, kind of. So even an assertion that you've read a paper or something like that can be a nano publication. So it's kind of like the size of a post on social media, but it's got semantic structure to it. So it's like publishing a small knowledge graph. And nano publications are really cool, but we also see another trend in science, which is like scientists engaging on social media very heavily. And sharing, a lot of scientific knowledge to their followers and broad audience. So it can be scientists, but it can also be just like anyone. And there's tons of valuable discourse that's happening on social media. And this is just a kind of an example of why scientists are using social media. And there's two main reasons. One is to get rapid feedback that they don't have to wait, months for the review process. They can immediately engage with their audience. And two is reach. So they get much broader audience than they would normally get if they're publishing in some journal that no one's ever heard of, no one's ever going to see it. Everyone is trying to figure out which papers to read from among, a million different options. So yeah, social media for scientists has really become a very strong sort of, a lot of science is being done there actually. Just look at this sort of, 400,000 views on this kind of assertion that the scientist is making. They're, pretty influential, but but this is like a lot of traffic that you don't get through the normal scientific process. And finally, we have this kind of trend of, open science, which is an older trend of, fair open access data. But really, like, all of these methods are kind of not, there's a lot to be done in terms of like combining the best of all of them, right? Because Twitter is not, it's not fair, and it doesn't allow you for this kind of fine-grained semantic publishing, really expressing what you want to say. It only gives you this kind of, 280 characters, natural language text, maybe an attachment, but that's it. Nano publications give you that kind of expressiveness, but they don't give you the feedback and reach because it's just publishing out into some database, and who's going to find that. And yeah, and then so there's this kind of very happy medium, it seems like, of being able to embed basically not only inside these or live feedback and reach for these kind of publications. So this is what we're calling sense-making networks. That's the name of the project. We can go into detail like why sense-making. To kind of show you one other thing before we dive into the project. I think we can, like, one way to imagine, like, to think about this is what we're trying to do is like adding a new layer to the academic graph. And we talked about this a lot in previous seminars with Chris and Ellie and others. Right now, sort of the traditional scientists are, this is like the sort of representative opinion of a traditional scientist, are saying, Twitter isn't really academic work, right? But we're trying to change that perception. Like, we think that Twitter actually is part of the academic work. And it's funny here, right? Like, he gets thanked for inspiring the work with his tweets, but that's kind of just an acknowledgement. Like, no one is going to cite his tweets, even though they might have been actually the inspiration for some research that got published, right? But that is, that is due to norms, it's due to like publishing infrastructure, it's due to a lot of things, but we want to start changing that. We want to lean into the fact that actually a lot of academic work is being done on social media. So yeah, it's coming and looking at the existing academic graph, which is traditionally just like scientists here, these traditional output, these papers that are citing each other, and then this kind of ignored layer of sense making, these blue dots like the posts and the different objects on social media. These are enclosed and fragmented. Their semantics are cross platforms, a mess. It's not really any layer that we can actually see, most of us. But what we're trying to say is, let's make this a layer that we can actually see and interact with and integrate into the science infrastructure. And it's much more inclusive, right? Like this kind of new updated academic graph would be so much more inclusive, because anyone that's participating in the discussion around science, just like on social media, you have people that aren't even professional scientists, but they're really good curators of science, they're good explainers of science, they know how to make a TikTok video explaining some complex concept. All of that stuff can be part of this kind of sense-making layer, which is a little more fluid. It maybe doesn't have the same, it's not going to get you tenure, maybe, I don't know, maybe in some future world there won't be tenure, or it will get you tenure, I don't know. But even if we don't know exactly how we'll treat it in terms of like incentives, it's still something that we can see has a lot of value just in helping us make sense of science. So this is kind of the vision we're going for, is like integrating this kind of discourse into infrastructure. And yeah, let's talk about like how that I can practice. And also feel free to like stop me at any point and ask questions. I'm happy for this to be mostly like the discussion and like hearing some stuff about different some questions, and we can talk about seminar. So the way we're thinking of it currently is sort of two parallel efforts, and the first one we're focusing on is this kind of social media aggregation steps. I'll start with that one, and that is basically trying to defragment science social media. Right, we're seeing science social media fragmented, especially now with Twitter and all the problems with it. Many scientists are leaving to the other social networks. Some of them are open, some of them are closed, but we're kind of looking at closed social, open social, trying to refragment as many possible sources as we can. Wherever there's significant amounts of scientists discussing science, aggregating those using methods of crawling and scraping, and not stopping there, because that's what a lot of sort of existing efforts have done, like altmetrics, for those of you who are familiar, just kind of trying to aggregate all the mentions of a particular DOI or something like that, and using that to like score research. We don't want to stop there, because we actually think that there's more actual meaning to these that I do here in this NLP module step, where I'll try to fix stops. Yeah. So that's a question. It's just like a comment there. Okay. So we're going to actually try to add some meaning to these posts that would happen in this kind of NLP module. And an example, right, just to give a more concrete example. So starting with this tweet over here, this is just a natural language text, and it references some research, right? But we don't really know. I mean, but as far as altmetrics is concerned, this is just a mention of that research. We don't know if it's positive, we don't know if it's negative, we don't know the role this research is playing. By using nano publications as a kind of template, as templates we can parse into, we can actually structure this claim with much more detail. So there's actually a nano publication template that fits like the review template, and then You can see an example here. So there's an assertion being made that has this text, which is the Twitter text. And the assertion is about, can current chatbots pass the Turing test or not? And then it cites as evidence this piece of research, this archive paper. And there's some researcher that made this. We can link that to her ORCID ID. So you can see already there's a lot more stuff happening. This, sort of the information that this post is actually reviewed. And it's something that's a lot more than you can do with just a mention on all metrics. So I'll show you a little later what you can actually do with this kind of thing. Yeah, so basically that is sort of adding the semantics, we call it, with the NLP module. And then you can kind of just use an API to provide, Chris has a comment there. Entity disambiguation and reconciliation is going to be challenging. Yes, indeed. Yeah, we can go into the weeds of that. There's a lot of devils.
Yeah, just continue. Well, I'm just making some mental notes.
Yeah. Right. So the sort of I think that sort of minimum viable prototype we're aiming for here is having some API that downstream applications can hit and pull in information related to these, extracted kind of social media objects that we parsed using NLP. And an example of that, just to kind of get us started, is this landing. Some of you have seen this. Thinking about sort of preprint servers, even like things like DeSci nodes that are like basically research, and I want to aggregate the mentions of that research across different social media networks. This is already being done on bioRxiv. They have the kind of Twitter pane, and it's again powered by Altmetrics, so it's just giving you the count of tweets. And adding this layer of semantics to these kind of things is like, okay, it's been mentioned on social media, but it's also, this is how it's been mentioned. And these are the sort of semantics of how it's been referenced on social media. There have been endorsements, there's been a thread summary, there have been inline annotations, there's been questions people have asked, et cetera, right? This can be, it's an open and diverse set of ways people talk about research. And that is kind of what we're thinking of as for a start, I guess, the first thing we're aiming for, basically. And then this kind of led us to think, okay, DeSci nodes has something quite similar to the bioRxiv server for preprints, basically. So we might be able to bring that into DeSci. And maybe just one final more step before we really open it up. I think there's this kind of natural trend. I'm trying to anticipate like how this, how this might develop. But I think once people see that these kind of what they're doing on social media is informing, these different kind of applications, and they see how semantics are beneficial, they might say, okay, I want to actually directly publish semantics. Like I want to directly say what I want on social media. I don't want to have to wait for some NLP module. It might make some error. It might not pick up my tweet. I want to be sure that I can publish exactly what I want. And then if I click here, I don't know if you're seeing my screen, but if you don't see it, then click on that animated GIF. I can also just I can share my screen too. Do you guys see the animation or do you not see it?
Yeah, if you click on the little Mastodon thing, then it shows you.
Okay,
but I don't think it automatically shows you.
Okay. Yeah, if you click on this Mastodon thing, it'll show you. But basically what's happening there is that, and this is just a very simple mock-up showing, what a sort of fork of Mastodon client might look like adapted for this kind of semantic publishing on social media. You kind of select your template, and then you can directly sort of post a review or question or all these different nano publication templates that refer to some research. So that's kind of a second stage. And again, that's something that I did want to bring up here, even though it might be a little further down the road, because I feel like that is something that, DeSci nodes might also, it might be an interesting synergy with what you guys are building with the publishing platform. Basically letting people, if maybe it's not building a direct social media presence, but giving people to publish these kind of nano publications and integrate it with social media. So yeah, that's just a thought that I wanted to share as well. And then, yeah, basically what this amounts to is kind of an aggregator for all the ways that we're researching, all the way that we're referencing research, and yeah, a lot of useful things we can do with that. Maybe we can open up for questions. I saw John, you wanted to ask something?
Yeah, I see you've got AT protocol over there. I'm curious on what your thoughts are on how these types of protocols are going to make this process you're describing easier, more difficult. because you're giving like an underlying layer where all social media, like an ideal scenario, all social media exists on that underlying layer, and then we have different pathways to visualize that. So instead of having to scrape Twitter and Mastodon, you're just tapping into this one protocol, and you get all the information about every social media post and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is that's a big question. I think a really promising sort of direction to go, even though it's kind of hard probably it's hard to move that direction, but maybe a little more context for what Jonathan is saying. Like these even activity, well, the underlying big very so it can support these kind of nano applications pretty natively. Like you can the fact that they chose to implement these kind of posts that look a lot like Twitter posts is just the way that what they chose to implement in the beginning. You could relatively easily expand this to support much wider set of these kind of structured objects, and then yeah, you don't really need the NLP at all if people are using this pretty heavily, which would be really interesting. Or you could move the NLP into the sort of authoring step where people are like publishing on social media. I mean, they're writing on social media, and then there's like a bot that's like suggesting for them like the templates or something like that.
Oh, that'd be cool.
So yeah, I think these new protocols are going to be they can be really impactful. I think they'll change. Like this is why I think if all we're doing is decentralized technology is building like clones of Twitter, then that's probably not leveraging the potential that's there, right? Like I think the real potential is when we start leaning into the like these open schema libraries and things like that. So yeah, I'm excited about it. But
for example, maybe how this relates to science metrics is like if we're building a giant repository of all knowledge and we put on that repository the measures, synergistic marks, as we like to call it, measures of engagement, measures of value that people give these specific pieces of research. Something like what you're building can go through and aggregate it all and play with the value marks in specific ways to create a wide array of different types of metrics. It sounds very similar to what you're doing as a plugin into that system, which is pretty neat.
So you're saying that, like, if I'm understanding, you're talking about like maybe downstream applications that are doing like this different kind of evaluation of all the data and trying to present different metrics, kind of like alt metrics, but with more open data and more structured data.
Yeah, and so it's taking what you're doing for social media and like applying it to number of downloads of a data set, number of downloads and then opens, number of downloads, opens, and then sends, number of citations of a specific section of the data set. All of these granular metrics just pushed onto a protocol similar to how likes are pushed onto a website for a piece of social media.
Right. Yeah, I love that. I think, yeah, that's a totally natural direction, like new alt metrics.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a particularly a fan of using AI models to structure unstructured data in a way that provides these interesting aggregates. I think the figure you have under the bioarchive paper is very interesting, and I think there's actually a lot of like really interesting inferences you could make using LLMs on the type of data. So I think that's that's probably a very promising avenue. Even something that, a lot of scientific platforms would be actually very happy to integrate with, right? I think today there's a lot of publishers and people in the space using Cite, which is essentially just, as you know, they take citations and they use some NLP to define whether the citation is supporting or contrasting, for those who don't know about what they do. So you could even think of that as like a altmetric plus, right? In a sense that it's like, not only would it give you access to its raw data, right? It doesn't force upon you like perhaps a cryptic algorithm that nobody really knows how it works, right? This is the case with altmetrics because a lot of the underlying algorithm to compute the final score, based on what I last read about it, is just not public. And I think this is interesting. So like, having both the opportunity to provide the raw data query via your API and the interpreted data that you might provide, right, as the NLP module, right? So like ideally you have to think from the start of like having these two possibilities built in that people can also query the raw data. I think there's also, we talked about that previously, I think there's very interesting synergies with OpenAlex, as like that system could become an entity type on OpenAlex. I think that would be interesting. So that would be particularly fertile grounds. And yeah, and in general, I'm curious. One of the things that is still unclear to me is what is how legal is it to take data from Twitter to put it in a database and then to feed it in another platform as you as an intermediary?
Yeah, that's a killer question. It's a good question. I'm actually literally right now writing an email because we're with Astera, we're looking for some lawyers maybe to consult with some of the data legality issues around Twitter. Twitter is particularly draconian lately, like they've changed their policies. So it is a like there's questions around it, but I think so. This raises, it's a whole topic, but I think I want to be creative about like how to get Twitter data out of Twitter, and I think there's ways to do it. Like I wouldn't be, even if they told me, okay, you can't just scrape Twitter and dump that data into some open database. You can't do that. You'll get sued by Twitter. I still think that wouldn't be the end of the game. Like I feel like, what if we had scientists like basically consent to having their data exported to some open platform or something like that. Like each scientist puts an emoji by their name or just signs up somewhere, and then like they're consenting to donate their data to science on Twitter or something. So that's like an option I've been thinking of as a kind of
Another check mark.
yeah, exactly.
Well, you could have a little flag in people's profiles and to be a kind of subversive in a sense, but a very interesting approach to consent around data.
And Blue Sky already does something kind of similar. It's not the same because they don't need that, but they have like if you put a test tube on your post in Blue Sky, some algorithm will pick that up and put it in like a science feed, which is an interesting kind of development because they have open feeds and anyone can build a feed. So someone just made that, and now it's creating sort of incentive for people to actually add that test tube to their posts, and then it gets picked up. So
I'm very curious about that. I don't want to derail too much, but is anyone paying people for putting that test tube on? That is a very interesting incentive potential.
I never thought about that actually. I don't know if it feels like it's just like a game right now. It doesn't feel like it's pretty early, but
very cool.
Yeah.
It
What's
reminds
the
me
name?
of hashtags before they stopped being used.
They're still on IRC.
Interesting theory though. Like you could say that hashtags and what Blue Sky is doing with its emoji selection to create threads is actually what you need to cross the chasm in the network effects of these social networks. And after a certain size, you don't need these hashtags anymore, right? It's like they're bridging otherwise distance discourse, right? They're essentially discourse highways, right? And so in the life cycle of a social network, at some point you need the discourse highways to connect these small world communities that otherwise don't speak to each other. But once you get sufficient scale, everyone is fine in little bubbles, right? Because there's sufficient interactions.
Yeah, there is definitely an interesting trade-off, and this is part of the question about like adding these semantics from the NLP, because it feels like there's this kind of trade-off between scale and size, as you noted. Like scale and structure. Like the more structure you have, the less data you need. So by being able to add more structure, we can sort of reduce the need for data, because like an example I like to think of is like if I don't know what like 1,000 scientists are reading right now, sometimes it's just enough for me to know what like 2 people that I respect a lot, that I have like a lot of prior knowledge and there's a lot of structure in our relation. And I need a lot of data. I just need we can, by getting people to add structure basically to their post, we can sort of alleviate some of the challenges of network effects and needing a lot of data.
That reminds me a bit of what we were talking about yesterday with the idea of like moving from a content ecosystem to a curation ecosystem, where it's like once you have this structure, then it's much easier to curate the information into like feeds of relevant information instead of needing to repeat or re-aggregate or recreate a lot of the stuff that's already been made. Related to that question though, that like Chris had brought up of like, all right, are there legal issues with Twitter? Are there other like questions that you currently are having around like the feasibility in any of these steps that feel like they would be most relevant?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely questions around each of these. I think, yeah, Twitter is definitely a big question. Around the NLP, I think there's just questions around like engineering questions, like how to do this well at scale. Yeah, and then Levy, we've been talking with you about the sort of some of these agent-based approaches and yeah, a lot of very promising things, but also that raises some more challenges around scale. So, you know, in NLP, I can show you just a demo. Maybe I can share my screen. This might be just another, just something you can see where it's going. Yeah, I've showed a lot of you this, but if you haven't seen yet, you can click on that demo in the Figma and it'll take you here. So basically, you know, right now we're just using a very simple like open source LLM. You put your post URL here, and it goes and you can run the LLM, and it will parse the text and try to extract some, you know, there's some predetermined set of labels, and yeah, there's a lot of ways this needs to improve. Like, yeah, so it's saying that this tweet was like an announce of new research, and yeah, this was an easy one, but just for the demo. So someone's sharing a preprint on Mastodon, so someone is announcing new research, so you can add that kind of semantics for the announce. But there's a lot of questions here around like how to do this well and at scale, and some of these agent approaches like LangChain. For example, like here I'm just tagging the kind of label for this post, but I might also want like more details. For example, if I decide that it's a recommendation or a review, maybe if it's a review, I actually want to go in and see, is it a positive review, is it a negative review, and other stuff like that. So each of these labels might have more downstream decisions I want to make to populate more of the schema, basically.
So I feel you might also you might think about the heuristic model such that you capture subsequent tweets that are essentially associated to the same topic. You know, like when people post like
a thread, you mean?
Right, a thread, exactly. So like you capture the whole thread, and then of course there's questions, I suppose, around what's the granularity of the queries you run over to the LLMs. Do you do it, you know, like similar when you run embeddings, right? Semantic embeddings, right? Do you embed just the abstract? Do you embed the entire paper, or do you embed section by section, right? And then you have more granular capability to queries. For example, hey, I want to find papers with similar statistical methods, right?
Right.
Which benefits from section level embedding, for example. So I'm kind of wondering if you've been thinking about that in the context of the NLP. And I think perhaps the better question even is like, what do you think is the highest leverage point that you could first implement for this?
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, I think, yeah, I was thinking of the sort of that landing page as a kind of as an initial prototype, but I'm not sure that's like the highest leverage point. It's probably it's a trade-off between like it's relatively simple. So yeah, I think some higher leverage point might be like feeds, like having you know, the ability, for example, to follow scientists across multiple social networks feels like a big pain point right now. Like if I'm not able to sort of scatter my attention across like, you know, more than like 2 social networks, like Mastodon and DeSci and Twitter. Like having the ability to sort of aggregate from all those and having feeds that'll sort of say this research was popular and it got tweeted here and here and here and here, and like do that for you and show you like what you should, basically give you the feeling that you're not missing out by not being on DeSci. So yeah, that would be early on.
Yeah, I feel like the let's say within that time you have around the Astera Scholar in Residence program, like something that would show real traction and have like fast impact would be something like, hey, here's a web-based service with an API that crawls across these different network, right? And the first level is just gathering this information accurately and somehow trying to solve around problems around identity disambiguations and things like that, right? Although it's a rabbit hole, you know, and then provide that feed to bioarchive, to, you know, archive, all sorts of different platforms out there, because they would love it, right? For them, like doing they pay a ton of money for the Twitter API access. They only have Twitter, right? Last I checked. So like a lot of these, and not just them, right? There's probably a lot of journals and publishers that would love a little, you know, embedded integration of all the scientific discourse that happens across scientific platforms, right? So I think that right there would solve like a need that's both a market need. So there would be a willingness to pay, well, provided the whole data legality thing is sorted, right? But there would be a willingness to pay from for-profit entities, certainly, on that.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and then I think like step 2, chapter 2 is like the whole LLM experimentation, and perhaps like a combination of like a functional API service and proof of concepts around making sense of that data.
So even just after Twitter today, just adding some of the new social networks, the mentions of research, basically, kind of adding that as just a first step, getting a good API there, a good scalable kind of API, and adding another layer later. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very potentially very impactful like first step, and very realizable also in terms of like engineering.
Yeah, I agree, and this is really helpful, kind of your distinction between sort of separating the NLP layer and the sort of just the raw data layer, because the NLP is more experimental, and then just kind of giving the raw data itself is we already see it getting used because things like altmetrics. So yeah,
I think so. Like just the aggregation itself is already a source of value, right? So like the NLP adds value, but it's uncertain how much value it adds, right? So but it's the exciting bit, right? That's the R&D exciting bit. I'm very interested and fascinated by like what could come out of that.
Question related to the altmetrics things. Is there already an aggregator? Because I know everybody's using and putting their altmetrics up. So who's currently aggregating for them? Do you know that?
Yeah, it's Dimensions. So
Dimensions?
Dimension is an open scientific database that has it's open core, let's put it this way, that sells all sorts of analytic services. And I believe, if I'm not wrong, that now Altmetric uses the Dimension database, or at least partly, and it might have its own complementary database, I think, for blog scrapping and perhaps even Twitter APIs and these things, right?
Yeah. Right. So it's kind of trying to be, as a first step, even a little going in the direction of these more open altmetrics.
You know, it would be cool, Ronen, actually, I'm thinking about it. I mean, it's silly. It's bad for science, okay? But like imagine a little like Rosetta. You know, like how the altmetric has a little kind of like round shape, you know? Like imagine one, yeah. Imagine one that tells you on which social platform the discourse is happening, right? It's not good. I'm not saying it's good, but people would be very curious. They're like, oh, this is where my community is. Oh, this is where that community is, right? And then they could follow that density of like correlated usage, right, based on their networks, and to decide on which platform they go eventually, right? I mean, it's not good.
Interesting.
Right. I think it's but it would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean,
as a scientist, I'd be very curious to know on which platforms my community is, you know?
Right. And it's a stepping stone towards like eventually like you would want it to less, I guess, matter even which platform. Yeah, because it'd be just easier for you as a scientist. Like I can track, like you said, wherever my research is being discussed, I can be aware of that.
Yeah. Ideally, I think we need to move towards a future where all of this data is open state, right? So like where we have access to all this data, and all of this data can be connected, right? Cross-referenced, which is not the case today. So
Also, when you're browsing a website, you don't care where it's hosted. I mean, the browser can interpret it because there's some protocols underneath, and it doesn't matter where it's hosted. So it's kind of feels like that a little bit. But yeah, it shouldn't really matter where the discussion is happening. Like each app might have some special functionalities it's providing, but the core, a lot of them are doing similar stuff. And what about DeSci nodes, like and codecs? Like, how do you have thoughts on like? We talked a little bit about sort of connecting, maybe connecting the APIs.
yeah, so I could see like two ways. First way is just the same thing as you would do in bioRxiv, right? So it's like an app. So we, on the application level, DeSci nodes, we use these markers to provide access to that discourse, right? The other path is saying, well, let's not integrate at the application level, but let's integrate at the protocol level. So the data coming out of this API is essentially committed as data on the protocol, on what we call codecs, right? This collaborative open data exchange. And then the application pulls out that data, but it pulls it out not as a Twitter post, but as an annotation that is of an entity type annotation, right? So those are two ways, right? One way is like API to app. The other one is API to protocol, protocol to app.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. What is your sense of like the readiness of the data infrastructure for these kind of large scale, social media data on ceramic or whatever that's being stored? Is that something like that's far away or not so far?
No, I don't think it's far away. I think it depends on the scale we're talking about. So that's a question. Of course, if you tell me we have 10 trillions, I'll be like, okay, wait a second. But I think, I mean, it's a question for the tech team. It's a bit beyond my expertise level, but I think by like we're ironing out some of the very basic building blocks around it, and I would say in a couple of months it should be like operational and functional, right? Now we don't know what kind of load it can support, and it will also depend on the number of participants in the network so that it scales. So there's going to be a ramp up period for like achieving scale on it. But yeah, I think I don't know. We would have to consult, but essentially the idea would be to be able to just mirror the content right on the protocol layer.
Yeah,
and I think your app in that case,
yeah.
so like the thing that's a bit funny here is that so your app, your application, your web service would have a DID key, and it's the DID key of your web service. And so it's not Ronen or Ellie or Chris that have the DID key to do this. It's like your app, right? It's like one of the secrets coded into your backend, right? And that DID key would essentially sign all of these messages with your provenance as the entity that has added it onto the network, right?
Right. Okay. And then those posts themselves would also have like the information about the like original entity, if we can do that, like you mentioned, like entity linking with the original like scientist that posted it. If they have
exactly, they would be in the metadata. And these
right.
could be either something in which you take a pre-existing entity in Codex, like an annotation, or you can define your own schema for it, right? So you can define your own schema and call it my entity, whatever it is, right? And or you could even define, maybe what happens is that you have multiple different schemas for different things, right? So it's a question around schema definition, but it's completely open in that regard, right?
Are you planning to have some kind of mirror of similar to how OpenAlex has like author nodes, for example? If you had an author node, then we could try to link in the Codex network to the author instead of just having it in the metadata. And then you could index by author and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. So like so definitely that's something we're thinking about, like what is the extent of the different entities, right? Because right now, like for authors, we're defaulting to ORCID. But we can mirror the ORCID record as the entity author on the protocol, right? Just like you could do with grants and organizations and all sorts of different like entity types, right?
Right. So it's a question, I guess, of which kind of queries you want to support and yeah, for what applications.
Exactly. It's like how important is the query type so that it's fast, right? So that it doesn't scale in a bad way with the size of the data, right? You want to have linear scaling over like a whole class of queries. And so you have to not linear, like constant scaling over a whole class of queries. And you have to like figure out which ones are those queries that are going to be most important,
Yeah. So right. That's helpful. So it's kind of like thinking about if it's in the metadata, it's probably just something that they're not going to be queries about. And if you need to query it, then it should probably become an entity of itself.
So it depends on the type of metadata, but this is a rabbit hole.
Okay.
Yeah.
A rule of thumb. Yeah.
And Chiaki, you left a comment in the Figma. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah. I was wondering to this Twitter browsing app. Can we know the discourse with this platform that the discourse that led on Twitter, like the paper a single paper can have a multiple contexts, then can we know the context that is mainly discussed on Twitter or other social platforms that can with like or by aggregating those tweets and embedding into the vector and like calculating similarity of these vectors.
So are you saying like you're talking about like can we sort of summarize the discourse maybe using some NLP methods? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, summarize and then extracting the main context that the paper is mentioned. Like,
Yeah.
so we can extract the context other than the citation networks. So can we
Right.
do that?
Yeah,
Is
that,
there any
that would be
possibility?
another service. That would be another service that would sort of be enabled by the data. But yeah, I think it's interesting, and it kind of ties back to the point of, when Altmetrics just shows you the count of the tweets, like it doesn't say it again doesn't
Yes.
tell you anything about like how people are talking about it. And you're saying I want another kind of app that would show me here are the main discussions that were happening. Like here's a summary of those discussions. I think that's eminently possible probably with some of the new GPT models. But it's just a question of having the access to the data, I guess.
Okay, thanks.
So I think another killer feature you might think about doing, Ronen. Again, it's probably not in the best interest of science, but somehow these ideas keep surfacing. Like having like on your service page, right? So imagine you just have a service page. It's an API-based service. It has documentation and these things. This pretty bland thing for like developers and platforms to connect to, right? But you could have a page that essentially provides like a ranked, most active science social conversations, right? And people would go on there just to look at that, right? They're like, oh, what the hell is happening on Blue Sky this weekend,
Yeah.
And they would just go on that, right? That would create eyeballs. That would lead to eyeballs. Yeah.
Yeah, like a leaderboard for discussions about science. Like what is the most talked about paper?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a cool feature actually because
most talked about. Yeah, you could have like a actually that would be a valuable product also in itself, right?
Yeah.
And also I
When you
thought
decided,
that
yeah.
sorry. And also I thought that when the discourse can be searched, we can search the paper by those the questions. So depending on the question, they give the query and then can hit to the discussions attached to those Twitters, then can find the equivalent papers they want. That is one another values that can provide, I thought.
And do you mean questions that are inside the paper, basically inside the PDF, or do you mean questions that are on social media?
Questions that the researchers have. So many other disciplines can, other people in other disciplines can know the specific questions that is solved in other disciplines.
Can you give an example, maybe?
So one might be interested in the car driving, and then how can I know the friction with the road, and then they want to know the mechanical response of the cars, but he's in the concept engineering or the simulation background, then he can search by those question of the mechanical response. Then he can hit to those Twitter discussion, then can find the paper attached to those tweets.
Yeah. So I'm hearing kind of you're saying, can we sort of surface questions out from?
Can we surface papers based on could you think about that as a search engine for papers? I mean, it's an interesting and kind of provocative question to some degree. Like, I wonder what it would look like. But imagine and this I think ties into another topic, which is how do you plan to select what is science discourse and what is not? Have you already, I mean, we know about the heuristic filters, right? Which is there's a DOI link, there's a link to another platform, there's a, you know, some sort of like URL, like some string match that happens over the data on the API that tells you this is likely to be relevant to science, right? But like, have you thought a bit more about that? What were your, where's your,
Yeah, and it's one of the central questions as well. I think, for the MVP, it's looking just at kind of the simple DOI. Ultimately, I think this. So you know Zotero, right? Zotero. The Zotero, the reference manager. They have a plugin that basically knows how to extract metadata from across the web. Like they can tell you something, a newspaper article, in a podcast, as a blog post. So they have these like, thousands of like these translators basically for extracting metadata from web pages. So I'm imagining something more along those lines where basically any reference you mention can be part of this network. Like, anything that scientists often talk about, like a podcast, and it's not necessarily a science research object, but it's also interesting. So I would definitely like to expand the scope of what is considered science. And it might be just like, we're following a network of different scientists, and then like all the URLs they're mentioning are basically part of this. And we have to have some way of saying, is this URL that's like, a cat video on YouTube, or is it a URL to some science research? And maybe the NLP would be helpful there. So yeah, I'm thinking along those directions, and starting from like the very, very solid things, but then gradually expanding it.
yeah, super cool. I'm super excited about like being an early integrator here and helping out as much as we can to make this project work out and be a success. I think the space would have like a huge benefit from being able to connect to such a API stream aggregator. I think you also probably have a great product on your hand if you create like a front end for it that just surfaces the top conversations. I'm not saying you should do it, but I think it's definitely something I would use, right? This is why I think it'd be cool. I kind of wonder, another thing is like, don't you fear the system might get drowned by a very much winner takes all conversation result? But to some degree, it's completely inevitable, right? Because right now, like if I look at science Twitter, at least mine, and this is perhaps because I have biases in who I follow, like I'm flooded with like mega influential AI papers, right? This is what's happening to me. I don't know if this is me particularly because I'm in my, this is kind of like my correlated network. But I kind of wonder about like the things people talk less about, and like, well, let's put it this way. I wonder about where this plugin in API and aggregation service provides most value. My intuition, it's around AI discourse right now, but I'm wondering how this discourse is distributed across fields, essentially,
You mean sort of trying to pick up the less talked about things? How could we sort of get at those as opposed to like just what everyone is kind of the current hype bubble?
Yeah, or just even understand how Twitter how discourse around science like is concentrated. Where does it concentrate? Just to understand a little bit the mapping of that discourse would be interesting.
Right. Yeah, which fields, like how much discourse is happening in which fields, and like
Exactly.
is AI
And I think,
like the most
and imagine this is another killer, like a web page, right? Like you have fields with little balloons, and you essentially represent like dynamically over time, like where discourse is happening around which fields, and you can just kind of like see these evolve, and you can be like, oh, right now we had the peak around material physics. We all know why that happened, right? Then we had the peak around AI. Oh yeah, around 2023, right? We had that big peak. So it's kind of like it'd be kind of like, again, this is more of a research project than a product probably, right? But like interesting to like visualize how conversation density around topics evolve over time. And you can do this really well now with LLM and automated classification of topics to taxonomies and ontologies and control vocabularies, and even just using embeddings.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting questions about like trying to understand actually what is happening around science. Open data would allow that. And to your earlier question about the sort of yeah, improving feed algorithms as opposed to having Twitter sort of dominate. And it's giving you the things that are the most engaging, and then the high impact influencers. Part of the motivation here is yes, again, by having open data, you'll have more options to see other things. So that's the hope, similar to kind of what DeSci is trying to build. So I think, yeah, tapping into some of that, like having people with multiple feeds, open, and by having structured data, you can do a lot of cool things, like with the NLP. Like, for example, one of the sort of early use cases I've been thinking about with NLP is like, just show me a feed of all the grant opportunities. And that's it. And that's a hard thing to do on Twitter right now. You basically can't do it. And that's also a kind of low cost, high impact, because it's very easy to categorize those with LLMs. So it's relatively easy to set up a feed like that.
Yeah, I hear you. I've been long frustrated by Twitter's search function. As you all know, once you see a tweet and you liked it and you thought it was actually useful, but then you're like, okay, can I find it? And you remember like a couple of words around that tweet, you're not finding it again. It's lost. It's in the void, right? And I asked myself, why don't they do a better search? And then I figured it out. I think it's by design. It's a feature that search is so bad, right? Because it prevents scrapping at scale of their using search. It prevents, all sorts of like, because who's searching on Twitter, like, except weird bots, pretending to be human.
Right. Yeah.
So I think it's by design essentially, but yeah, that's my conspiracy theory of the day.
Yeah. No, totally. It's crazy, like how much that it could be such a more powerful tool for thought, but it's kind of because of the business incentives and stuff, it gets kind of blocked.
Another thing
maybe,
that
go ahead.
Another thing that like what you said about like how do you filter out certain influencers, content that is being like injected into Twitter, like this sort of what you described as like someone is just overloading with content, maybe it's a bot, whatever. So having some sort of a ability to select what is the social graph, right, that you're interested in right now. Okay, assume we solved the ambiguity between the entities and stuff like that. So basically you will be able to kind of filter out whatever accounts you're not interested in seeing, and then creating these feeds based on your social graph or based on whatever configuration you choose. We need to all of these questions. Yeah. We need to ask them and then see what structure will allow these sort of queries to be efficient.
Yeah, that's also a great point, and it kind of Chris he's really helped me understand some of the sort of thinking about like how to think about philosophy as a kind of consent to see information from this people, like consent to have my attention on this person. I want information that this person is sharing, and I think that's something again that like that there's some cool applications you can build just from using like someone's social graph as a kind of way to structure their feed. Twitter has the kind of following and for you, so it does let you kind of opt for your in network, but it doesn't let you do anything in between. So for you is a lot of like blue check people that pay to get in your feed, and following is just your followers. But what if you could do like friends of friends and something like that? You could do all kinds of other alternate graph based kind of structures.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or like graphs based off of topics as well. So the idea of like sometimes I'm really interested in what this academic is saying, and sometimes they're talking about their Christmas tree, and that's not currently what I'm looking at, right? And so the idea of being able to surface a little bit more of like it goes back to the question I think that we were asking earlier of like how do you determine what's scientific? And it can't always be based off of social, it can't always be based off of topic. There's a lot of questions there.
Right. Yeah. That's why I'd like to see this kind of blur the boundaries between what is science and what is not. And giving people just control to modulate it. Like maybe someone wants to see actually like posting some article or show me every link this person's sharing. But yeah, having the ability to play with that.
Yeah, so something that I would like to experiment with is just like chatbot assistant, that you kind of ask natural language queries, and it will, translate it into a, like a graph query to the backend, right? And retrieve whatever, whatever it finds. Like, first of all, maybe, you confirm that this is the correct query and maybe some explanation about the query. And then, then you get this, for example, show me, all of my friends that cited my papers, right? So you need kind of like this traverse of length 3, so the chatbot will produce this traverse, will kind of verify with the person that is trying to query it, will verify this is what you want, and then execute the query. And then you can think about, like, if you know the structure of the graph, if you know the schema, so you can come up with I'm sure people will come up with very interesting queries.
Yeah, it's part of but it's hard with this kind of project. I feel like there's so many cool things that you can do, but it's also hard to do sometimes the first step. So yeah, we're constantly kind of navigating that tension.
Yeah, but I think
Yeah.
I think you have a solid path to a great first step, man. Like if you get, probably you don't need all of the social media feeds, you probably just need 1 or 2 as an MVP. Store the outgoing data in a Postgres database, make a simple API available,
Yeah.
and people will use it. I would, and I know people that would.
Yeah, you've been really helpful. I mean, this is kind of, you've helped, I think, put us in that kind of place where we're focused on that sort of very concrete kind of first step. Yeah, so be excited to update as we develop it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What I like is that it has like a plan for, like, it has like a, like all of these projects are set and everything, they're like subject to like path contingency, right? Like you have to take the right turn every time, right? And to like have measurable impact. So I think there has a very good like step-by-step impact road mapping that can be produced out of that as a further proposal, perhaps, for like next funding opportunity and things like that.
Yeah, Astera also has like a continuation. So if this goes well, I think the first year, then that would be an option. Or figuring out other opportunities for sure. Okay. One question. I mean, we don't have to talk about this time. I think there's a kind of, we've been talking a lot about incentives in previous discussions about like these incentive mechanisms and using contribution data to sort of structure incentives. So I think that's something I'm interested in talking about, but maybe that can just be some follow-up conversation as you guys are thinking about some of these peer review processes and new ideas. So thinking about maybe how to disconnect to some of the sort of social media stuff.
Maybe I can do like a very quick like tangent on this, because it's a very interesting topic. So I'm eager to extend beyond the hour. By the way, if everyone wants to go, this is the end of the seminar.
Yeah.
Fine, you don't need to stay. One of the really interesting thing to think about is, like, imagine, so you make an open state database and assume it's scalable, it does great queries, it's fantastic, right? And it also has the properties of making data as fair as possible, within the boundaries of what is technologically feasible without human intervention, such as metadata curation. Okay, so like imagine you have that, take that as a premise, right? The thing is that system in itself is not valuable until there's data. When it takes data in, it makes data more valuable than if it was outside the system by virtue of the technological affordances that is provided to that data, right? So it's a good thing. The challenge with that, and then imagine you make it completely permissionless, right? Not only reads are permissionless, but writing operations are permissionless, right? So you have a situation which is very unusual, right, in IT architectures, those types of architectures. So like the question is, like, how can you create incentives that to some, in some way incentivizes both data curator to add valuable data on the network, and data creators and data curators to produce accurate value signals of that data, right? So I think it's like this joint, optimization problem, right? we've been, and I think there's some interesting like mental models around this, right? You could imagine, for example, well, there's a certain order in which data should be curated, right? The first question you should perhaps ask yourself is it permissible to have this data on the network, right? That's perhaps first point to start, right? Does it infringe on copyright law or does it infringe on data protection laws, right? So this would be like the kind of like layer. Imagine you have like a Swiss cheese model, right, of curation in which you have multiple layers that interact to kind of like catch out the bugs. And so that's like the first layer, right? Second layer could be something like, well, is it described with appropriate metadata so that it's even queryable in the first place and it's even findable and actionable by machine agents, right? And the third question could be something like, well, given that it's, permissible and fair, is it original? What is the provenance, right? Because one could argue that the network should value provenance, right? It should not just value data, it should value provenance. For example, has it been deposited by an original contributor, like a scientist, who's credited, right, in the contributions, right?
And plagiarism detection, basically.
Exactly. So like is there a provenance premium, right? So it's an interesting problem to ask because like is there value to provenance? I think yes, there's definitely value to provenance because it creates onboarding and network effects and it provides those. At the end, you want to maximize the value of the network, right? So that every network participant that draws on that data and writes on that data benefits, right, from the aggregate value that builds up. And then the final question is like, well, is this data that's been posted, is it verifiable, right? Like if it's a publication, is like, well, is there open code, open data? Is the work computational reproducible, has been peer reviewed? Like the more like the higher order things, essentially, right? So yeah, so this is a little bit the way we're thinking here is like, is there a possible configuration of incentives or models, or I think they should be plural, right? This is another thing. I think they should not be like a single incentive layers to rule them all. I think that's a mistake. I think we need to have the potential to create multiple incentive layers. And perhaps what we should even be most concerned about is not the incentive layer per se, but it's to create the technological primitives that enable the creation of incentive layers, right? So this is where we're thinking, it gets yeah. So yeah, these are just some couple of random thoughts I'm throwing at you.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. I would add another layer on top of the verifiable. I think like the subjective value it's bringing to different people is also another. That's kind of the altmetrics layer. So like, how many people have added this to their, listening podcast list? How many people?
Yeah, relevance.
Cited this. Relevance. Exactly. Yeah.
So that's really interesting because I had that initially, and then I'm like, and I realized it's actually a very thorny problem. Like relevant for who? It's a very thorny problem to solve. Imagine there's an arbiter, an oracle of godlike powers who decides if something is relevant or not, right? Seems very peculiar as an entity, right?
Well, there you go. With your plural, you have plural, right? You basically everyone is his own oracle. Like I'm an oracle for if something is relevant to me. You're an oracle if something's relevant to you. And then I have my network of friends too. That's I think also a big key part. Because we have social graphs and we can kind of decorrelate. Like if we're all a clique that thinks something is relevant, then it's less representative set of people think something. It's kind of we talked about that in one of the last meetings. So yeah, I think social graphs plus relevant signal maybe.
Yeah, I like this idea of social relevancy as by using stigmergic marks. I think there's something there. And there's even something there potentially by using stigmerging marks in other platforms, right? So like, for example, imagine if we have from your API, there's discourse, scientific discourse associated with this object, right? That actually starts making it relevant. Because I think there's a lot of really interesting questions around this. How do we, because, for example, preprint platforms, when you submit a paper, they do a relevance check. They're like, does it smell like science? Does it not look like complete gobbledygook? If yes, feature, right? Put it on the preprint platform. If no, this is, please read our terms of services, right? That's how generally attempts work. Here on this open state system, there's no such thing as the editorial assistant who manually approves of things, right? And there's also not necessarily like a thematic fit, right? It's not like you can come up with a terms of service that says, you have to, it needs to be related to cryptography. It's not going to be like that, right? So like the question is, how do you find measures of relevance? Because ultimately you could think of these curation signals as information that repositories pick up on, right? And repositories that act as node operators, they decide what they want to store, what's important. And for them to make the decision.
Like indexers.
Exactly, right? Like, so indexers and data hosters and storage, right?
Right.
And it's not just them, it's also the applications and the portals that use these curation marks to determine what they want to surface, right? So it really has huge value that we create the right type of curation signals that map some sort of value, right?
Right. Yeah. This is a very interesting. I think thinking about these like new kind of journals, I guess you're called like, or whatever we call them, and how they, what information they're taking and how they're deciding basically what to curate and not.
Yeah, I think here is also there's a challenge in terms of semantics. If you want to determine, what is relevant for people, what is, subjectively, so giving like very predictable semantics to, to everything, like the connections between entities, it might be too rigid. For like when you want more general, to enable more general discourse and conversations. Yeah, I wonder like what is, if there's like a way to solve for this sort of a rigidness in the structure.
I think so. Like I think for like like imagine you have two schemas that have different semantics. They don't like to talk to each other. They don't even connect, right? They're just unrelated as possible. But there is a relationship between them because they might contain some data that actually says, hey, they're actually like likely to have some connection point, or they should be surfaced together, or what have you, right? One of the things you could think about is like, hey, you can be a metadata curation service, right? So what you do is you go on the network and you're essentially creating these nano publications and appending, semantics to, schemas, right? So you're appending a semantic an annotation with a semantic payload to a certain schema that doesn't talk to another schema, right? And so that semantic payload here can allow you to like to connect those a priori like incompatible data entities, right?
Yeah,
You can
I
go even like more hardcore into like thinking that the semantic payload could actually have transformations to like make these schemas speak to each other, right? Like mapping things and things like that. But I think there's degrees on how deep you want to go on this.
I think that's a powerful kind of idea that annotations are sort of connections between data schema that might not be compatible in the first place. That there's an annotation kind of provides that bridge between them.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, you could say, schema A, schema B, you could like both reference them in the metadata of the annotation or its schemas. And then you can say, semantic payload, something about these two schemas.
One agrees with the other or disagrees or whatever.
Yeah, or compare relations and entities and yeah.
Exactly. And I think this is a big issue in general, like the problem of like metadata curation is a big problem, especially in science.
How do we get like 4 companies working on this stuff?
Well, we got
big problems.
Yeah. We're already like counting our blessings here, Ronen, with you. So like, let's not ask for too much too soon.
Yeah.
I think Ronen, you know Nicolas. So there's this group they called Adam, and I think they're
the holochain ecosystem.
Yeah, it's like Nicolas worked in holochain before, and now is founding something called Adam, and there, yeah, he talks a lot about, like perspectives, like in the sense of each person has its perspective. The perspective is actually a graph, and it can have its own ontology, and then Adam is some sort of a layer that can reconcile between different perspectives and kind of act as a connector. Maybe it's worth
maybe we need to bring him into DeSci space.
diving into it. Yeah.
I love these out of the boxes, like, hey, this is a completely new take on social networks.
Yeah. No,
I love that. I think we're far from like the global maxima in terms of like social networks. I do fear, unfortunately, that our inbound instincts will lead us towards a spiraling degradation. But this could be just my
build lifeboats.
Huh?
Yeah. We need to build the lifeboats, I feel like.
Yeah, definitely.
The life rafts. Yeah.
Definitely do.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, it's always a lot of, my head is always like a lot of spinning with like new ideas and stuff. So
great. That's the whole goal. I'm happy it's spinning. Keep you guys entertained. Thanks a lot for presenting. Great seminar, and I'm looking forward to next week. And I think next week I'll present something about some of the ideas in the Codex white paper that should be upcoming early next year.
Nice. Sounds great.
Sweet. Thank you guys.
Thanks, Ali. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.